Around 1880, Scott County was lucky to get the Cincinnati Southern to make their route through Scott County. But did you know there were 7 other independent railroad lines in Scott County at one time? The very first one was the Knoxville and New River, which ran from Robbins into Brimstone. The others were the Kentucky and Tennessee Railroad, which started out up in Kentucky, but it went through no business on its way to Jamestown. The O&W Railroad went from Oneida to Jamestown. Helenwood had a short line that went up to Cherry Fork. Brimstone had their operation from New River to the head of Brimstone. And Glenmary Coal and Coke had their railroad line from Glenmary into Coal Hill. And the Tennessee, which ran through Scott County, Campbell County, and over to Anderson County. In 1889, the Tennessee was formed to go to Morning Glory to a coal mine. And by 1925, it had made its way all the way to Fort Mountain in Anderson County. And there was a lot of sidetracks. Dean had one that went up 3.5 miles. And Clinchmore's went 4.5 miles off the main line. The Tennessee was a total of 45 miles. And they started out in 1889. Their last loads was in 2013. And the Tennessee is the only one that is left. All the rest have had the rails pulled, the ties are gone, and the train beds, you're lucky to find one. Scott County, Campbell County, and Anderson County stand a good chance of losing the Tennessee forever. The owners of the Tennessee are trying to abandon the line, and with that, the rails will probably be pulled up, the tracks gone, and the road bed turned into, who knows. It's been said there was no history to the Tennessee Railroad by the people who are now trying to abandon it. But I say there was a lot of history, and it was in the men who worked there, the women who worked there, and their families. We're going to roll back the clock on this and just celebrate the people who did work on the Tennessee Railroad.
Next stop, Stanley Junction.
They had their ways of stopping the train. They had stops where they would stop and people get on and off and their mail, and leave mail. And some houses had a thing that come out from the post with a mail sack on it. But one day I was down Paint Rock with Grandma, and she was wanting to go to town, so we went over to a little place called Stanley Junction. And when she saw the train a-coming, she took her handkerchief and reached down and waved it backwards and forwards over the rail so the engineer could see us there, and it stopped. So I'm assuming it would stop about any place that somebody was there flagging if they needed a ride. It might not have. I mean, it might have. The reason we went to Stanley Junction was a lot of people met there. I mean, if it was raining somewhere, you could go on their porch and stand. And I guess that's the reason that we were there at that one.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't at the railroad crossing. So Stanley Junction is back up just from Pompey and Holler Cemetery. Peaceful Road is up here on the hill, and then that's up in there.
Oh, really?
You used to call it Morning Glory, too. Morning Glory and Stanley Junction, then was there.
Is that where Alma School was?
Yeah.
It was right there at Alma School.
Well, it was up in there somewhere, but Dad never did show me exact place where it was.
There's a mountain there, and they got a tunnel. They called it Tunnel Hill. And they would come down the river with 80 or 90 cars, but when they got down there to Stanley Junction, they had a sidetrack, and they would pull the cars off, and then they had a big engine would meet them, and they would double head across the mountain, and then that engine worked all night. My dad run that engine quite a bit. We called it the hill engine, and hauling them, they could haul maybe 7 or 8 cars across that mountain. And they'd work all night bringing the cars over to Oneida. It wasn't very many miles over there. It didn't take long to make a trip. 7 or 12 or something, I don't know exact, but there wasn't many. They'd pull them across that mountain the first time, then they would go back and start hauling the coal all night long. And I think it was 6 or 7 cars they would bring across that mountain.
Here we're standing at the north end of Stanley Junction on the Tennessee Railroad. Stanley Junction got its name because you had another line, be it just a branch line or whatever, coming back into your main line with the railroad. Well, Stanley Junction got its name because that branch line went up Stanley Creek to the mines at Terry Hollow and Morning Glory. And eventually your coal mines worked out probably 1920. Would have been probably the last of the mines with that. And then the branch line was left in for a while. There was even a coal tipple that loaded coal from strip mines probably in the early 1960s. Actually it would have loaded in the early 1970, 71 again when the coal boom hit. But here, eventually you had coal tipples on each side of here at Stanley, and that would have been 1905, 1910, somewhere in that neighborhood. When I started with the railroad here in 1974, you had your main line going through, then we're looking south. On the right-hand side, you had 3 side tracks. And usually those tracks would be, as coal was brought in up the river, they would set their loaded cars off that they couldn't get up the hill with in one trip. And then sometimes they would use a track to store empty coal hoppers. But usually with 2 of the old Alcos, probably 10, 12 cars would have been max. With 4 of the Alcos, I was thinking 20 cars would have been max at a time to bring up the hill.
Now, Alcos are diesel, right?
Are diesels. Steam, maybe 7, 8 would have been max, with your bigger engines that the Tennessee had, the 37 and the 39. I think those were the last two engines, the steam engines that the Tennessee bought. Scott County Historical Society today, continuing with our history of the Tennessee Railroad, and we're going to start today with and pick up at Newtown, which was south of Stanley Junction. And Newtown is just primarily a coal tipple with the railroad. It was used probably through into the early 80s when coal boom hit and ended. And then from Newtown you went down through River Junction and round into Winona. At Winona there was a Y also with the railroad there, and that was pretty much with the Y is the last thing that I remember. Don't remember any industry, coal, lumber, anything there. One of the history things was the bridge fell through one time with one of the engines from the Tennessee Railroad sometime early 1900s with it, and there's photos available from there. And from Winona you go on up through into Bull Creek, Cordell. And the thing with Bull Creek, at one time there was a little branch that went up to Bull Creek, and I'm sure it would have went with the lumber company, and that was probably pulled sometime 1920 along in there. I think some of the old railroad beds, some people will tell you that they can still find traces of it.
shipped was on railroad back then. There was no semi-trucks hauling anything, and the mailman we had rode a horse, and if he could bring Sears and Roebuck catalogs and all that stuff, but if there was anything big, we had to go to Normandy to the post office and pick it up. And that's, as the war started and work picked up, the train kind of kept going downhill. They didn't need as many. They didn't haul as much stuff, and they finally tore the depot down. But they was stopped from Stanley Creek to where'd that Newtown?
Yeah, Newtown.
Newtown.
I think they call that River Junction.
Yeah, they call that River Junction. We call it Newtown, but it goes to Cordell and then Winona and then Cordell and then Bull Creek and Normie and Montgomery and Smoky Junction. Every little village up through there had a train stop or a depot or just a little post office, and they'd bring the mail and drop it off.
We're standing at Norma, Tennessee. Where we're standing is the site of the original Norma Depot would have been about in this area here. It was probably torn down sometime in the 60s. When I was working here 74, there was a coal tipple in this area here. And you had another track in here for empties, and then your loads were dropped down to the north. There was another little side track to the side. And as you see, the side track on the other side is gone, and also the side track here that served the tipple at Norma is also gone. And that's about, well, this is everything that's left here today. R.J. Corman started pulling some of your side tracks, and that's probably been within the last 10 years or so, and I don't know if that would have been pulled then or not, but the only thing you have at Norma here is your main line.
Dad first went, sometimes he would leave home 2 or 4 o'clock, not get into dark. And then later on, they got a union, I think they call theirs the Fellowship, Brotherhood. They were only allowed to work 8 hours. But I have seen him come home and be scheduled to go back in 8 hours. And time he walked home and back to work, he wouldn't be rested 8 hours, but we didn't live far. I guess he could walk to work in 20 minutes from where we live. Mark Goodman lived over in that section, and Denver Reed and Lester Terry, and I guess there was some more lived on down towards St. Rock. But at the start, none of them had a vehicle to ride to work. And I didn't realize till I got older that the sacrifices that Mom and Dad had to do, and them, but they enjoyed life. I mean, on the weekends they'd visit and go and do, and it was a good life back then. And when I went to high school, I played ball the last year, and I have walked home in the dark down the railroad with no fear. And now, I wouldn't hardly walk across the road at night without being afraid.
My dad, he always was bad to blow the whistle on that train. He'd come up that river blowing that whistle. He could blow tunes. He'd blow "Oh How I Love Jesus" and others tunes. And the older people, most of them dead now, but when I came back a few years ago, they would say, I'd tell them I was Joe Chambers' son, and they would tell me, oh, we love to hear him blow that whistle. Those engineers would change their whistle when they get on a different run. And I can remember a little boy down there in that school, and I'd hear him go up that valley blowing that whistle. Sometimes I missed him so bad I'd cry. I wanted to see my dad. Of course, I was 5 or 6 years old.
We're standing in the old road bed that came off the Tennessee Railroad in what they call Montgomery Junction. This originally went up to, I think it's called Jeanette Lumber Company. It went up the holler up here. Well, the coal business came in, and it was a coal camp called Roaches Creek, but it was up the mountain. So what the railroad done, you came through here, went up toward Jeanette, and there was, when you got up there a little ways, 2 side tracks, enough to, I think, get about 30 cars, a couple of engines, and a caboose to shove back up the mountain. And that's what you had to do to get up to Roaches Creek. So when you got up to what's called runaround, you would shove up to what at the time was called Dean, which I believe was operated by West Coal Company at the time. You shoved up the mountain, and up at about the tipple, it went up to a 6% grade, very, very steep for a railroad. You would shove your empties on up past the tipple into the empty track, then you would come back down and couple into the loaded coal cars. When you coupled in, you would line up all the air hoses, charge the brake system on the cars. You would apply the brakes, walk them on, walk them off, make sure they're working. Then after you got your air charged, you would start leaving out of the load track at Dean. There was a little dip that you had to pull the car through that little dip. Well, as you pulled out, you would throw the derail on as the last car came out for your loads to start dropping in case you had one with a bad handbrake. It would go off the track there at the derail instead of coming on further down the mountain and all. But once you pulled out of the little dip, then it was all downhill. And you would tie up handbrakes depending upon the number of loads that you had coming down the hill. Well, the engineer would also apply air brakes. and it would be just full of smoke once you got till you got down to the bottom of the hill. Then when you got down to the bottom, you would make a cut on the loads with a number that you could get out with a sidetrack to run around. You would run around those cars, pull back out, and then the remaining cars, you dropped out by hand. You would tie up handbrakes, you would bleed off the air brakes, then a couple of the train crew would drive those cars till in the clear. And you would couple back into those loads and then come back to Montgomery Junction to the Tennessee main line. In Smoky, there was a branch line that went up Smoky Creek to a station called Newland, and I think there was coal and lumber up in that facility. My dad started with the railroad in 1940, and he said the steel and the siding was already pulled by the time he started in 1940 from Smoky. Nix Creek for the Tennessee Railroad. And here you are, you can see the curve. With this curve, the train crews could see their entire train going up either with their empties or coming back with the loads. So it was a good area to do your inspection. Make sure you didn't have any problems, hot journals or anything of that nature. But it's the only spot on the railroad to actually where you could see the entire train. Beach Fork, but I'm explaining what's called a Y on the railroad to Everett. What you would have, this would be your main line here at Beach Fork. Then you would have a line coming off that went up to Pee Wee and Clinchmore. Well, with your Y, you would come up and go on this way. But then you would put a switch in here and come back into your main line here. So this right here is called your Y. You could head in with a train and turn it around and go back in a direction that you just came from. This is your north leg of the Y here at Beach Fork. You would come off here and they would head that way to go up to Pee Wee and Clinchmore. Well, there was a switch on up here just a little ways that came back, and here would be your south leg of the Y in this area here that would come back in there to turn. The last time that this was used would have been in the 70s, sometime after 76. Southern Railroad stored excess boxcars on the line here going back toward Clinchmore, and kept those stored for a while. And what they would do, they would come all the way down here and come up the south leg and shove those boxcars back toward Clinchmore. And they were there for probably a year or so, maybe, somewhere in that neighborhood. And then picked back up and took to Oneida by the north leg.
You can see it.
And that's your south leg. There's a picture that I gave to Everett showing the alcoves of the Tennessee coming this way by the water tank. In the picture on this side of the track, there's what's called a section house, or a tool house, where they would store the motor car, tools, whatever they needed to work with. On the other side of the house, there was a Carroll family that lived there. The husband worked as on the section crew with the railroad, but the wife was a telephone operator, because the railroad had their own telephone system and they worked on train orders, and that's what she would do, was to write train orders. And there was what was called a semaphore board. It was an arm painted white with red stripes. If that arm was down, then the train had to stop, get an order before they could proceed. If it was up, the train could proceed on north. And I was told that the Carroll lady worked as a telephone operator with the railroad long enough that she got railroad retirement, and she got to age to retire. But as you can see, none of that is no longer here. and there was a siding at Rosedale, and it was working through in the 70s. The tipple was there. The company was Swisher Coal Company at the time that was loading there at Rosedale. And then from Rosedale, you come on up into Devonia, and at one time, before you get into Devonia, you went up into what's called Indian Fork, and it was called Moore's. And I can remember taking hoppers to store up in there at Moore's to be loaded there for Devonia. And then from Devonia, you went on up to Fork Mountain, to the end of the line, 45 miles from Oneida. What we've primarily covered during this has been the transportation side with the railroad. If you want to get back to the maintenance side, those were actually the men that kept the railroad up and was essentially the life of the railroad. And at one time you had section crews. You had one at Oneida, you had one at Winona, you had one at Norma, and then you also had one at Beach Fork. And those guys, they would travel in the little orange motor cars up and down the railroad, and there's often times that they would, meet together and work some of your bigger areas together. And another interesting factor that kind of touched on before, the railroad had its own telephone system. It tied in from Fork Mountain to the depot at Oneida, and it was the old hand-crank phone system. And there was also a crew that maintained those phone lines. And from those phone lines, your conductors a lot of times would get train orders as to where they would have to meet a train, or where they had to proceed to Oneida, or where they had to wait, or what have you. As mentioned earlier, we're here at the Scott County Historical Society in Huntsville, Tennessee. We're located in the old courtroom in the old courthouse. And as you can see in the background, we have everything from county court records from 1850 on through the present day. We don't have those. Are stored in your main offices. We have family books. We have information communities. We have a military section that is a continual work in progress with it to keep up with soldiers from the past to the present. Anything you're looking for history-wise, it's here.